The aurora path floated quietly above the blue-green planet below, glowing like a polished jewel against the dark sky. Inside the Starliner, people hurried through bright halls, preparing for the final shuttle launch before the ship began its long journey home. Mark Hale, a young human engineer with tired eyes and a grease-stained shirt, rushed through the corridors. He had spent the last 12 hours repairing a faulty coolant pump in the lower engine room, and now he was almost late for the last transport pod heading to the surface. He didn't want to spend another night locked inside a starship. Mark jogged into the shuttle bay, breathing hard. The bright landing lights reflected off shiny metal walls. A crowd of passengers was already lined up, all waiting to squeeze into the final pod. It was a small craft, only 12 seats, and he could see through the side window that only one spot remained. He let out a weak sigh of relief. At least he made it. But then the mood in the room shifted. The crowd suddenly stepped back, parting like a wave. Heavy footsteps echoed on the deck, each one deep and slow. The temperature in the bay seemed to rise. Mark turned to look. A dragon walked in. Dragons were rare to see on passenger ships, and this one looked especially intimidating. He was tall, his head brushed the lights hanging from the ceiling. His scales were dark bronze with deep cracks across them, as if they had been struck by countless weapons. A long scar ran down the left side of his face, almost reaching his eye. His wings were folded tight against his back, and each step he took made the floor vibrate softly. This was no ordinary traveler. This was a veteran. A war dragon. The dragon's breathing was heavy, and his movements slow, as though even walking caused pain. The soldiers escorting him saluted quietly. Whispers filled the bay. People stepped away from him not out of fear, but respect. Mark looked at the last open seat in the shuttle pod, then back at the dragon struggling to stay upright. The veteran lowered himself slightly, his claws trembling as he tried to reach the pod door. Mark didn't think long. He stepped forward, offering a small, nervous smile. "You take it," he said. "You need the seat more than I do." The dragon lifted his head. His eyes were golden and tired, but they focused on Mark with sharp attention. For a moment, the giant creature said nothing. Then he gave a slow nod, almost a bow. "You honor me, human," the dragon rumbled in a voice like distant thunder. Mark stepped back as the soldiers helped the dragon into the last seat. The pod door hissed shut. One of the deck officers turned to Mark and said, "Sorry, engineer. That was the final launch." Mark shrugged. "It's fine. I'll take one tomorrow." He barely finished speaking when the entire Starliner shuddered. It was not a normal shake. Not turbulence. Not engine noise. This was something deeper, like the ship itself had been struck by an invisible force. A low alarm sounded, pulsing red across the bay walls. Officers shouted to each other. Passengers jumped back in confusion. Mark grabbed a support rail as the deck tilted under his feet. Through the window, space rippled. It was as if someone had thrown a stone into a pond of stars. Waves of distorted light spread outward. Then the rip in space opened. A swirling tear, glowing with dark blue light, formed right in front of the aurora path. A wormhole. But wormholes were limited, controlled, stable things. This one was wild and unstable, like a living storm. "That's impossible," Mark whispered. Before anyone could react, the shuttle pod carrying the dragon fired its emergency thrusters and shot away from the bay. It escaped just seconds before the Starliner's gravity control failed. Mark's feet lifted off the ground for a heartbeat, then slammed back as emergency systems kicked in. Metal groaned. The hull creaked. A violent force pulled on the ship, dragging it toward the wormhole. Captain's voice crackled through the speakers, "All hands brace. We are caught in an unknown gravitational field." The message cut off as the ship lurched again. Mark hit the floor hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. He grabbed a railing and tried to stay steady as the world tilted around him. Passengers screamed. Lights flickered wildly. The aurora path was being pulled in. The tear expanded like a giant mouth swallowing the ship. The sight outside the window burned itself into Mark's memory, twisted stars, spiraling darkness, a deep blue glow like lightning underwater. The ship's metal skin began to warp, stretched by forces no human technology was built to handle. Panels snapped loose, floating in the air. Sparks rained from broken wires. The gravitational pull increased. Mark felt his body pressing down as if a giant hand was pushing him into the floor. He crawled toward a support beam, but the force kept growing. The last thing he heard was a massive cracking sound, as though the universe itself had split in half. Then everything went dark. Mark woke to silence, heavy, unnatural silence. Not the kind that comes from a quiet room, but the kind that follows disaster. His body lay against a cold metal floor. His head throbbed, and his vision blurred as he tried to push himself upright. When the world finally settled into focus, he realized he wasn't in the shuttle bay anymore. He was in one of the Starliner's emergency corridors. The lights flickered like dying stars, giving everything a strange, ghost-like feeling. He slowly reached for the wall and pulled himself up. The ship groaned around him, metal twisting under slow pressure. Every sound made his heart beat harder. He remembered the tear in space, the wormhole pulling them in. It didn't feel like a dream. His body hurt too much for it to be a dream. The corridor stretched ahead, empty and dim. A thin mist drifted near the ceiling, probably leaking coolant. The smell of burned wires filled the air. Mark coughed and covered his mouth, trying to stay calm. He needed to understand what happened, and he needed to find the rest of the crew. He staggered toward the nearest wall panel and tried the communication screen. It blinked weakly, then displayed static. No signal. He tried again, pressing different controls. Still nothing. The connection to the bridge was dead. He swallowed hard. Okay. Breathe. Just breathe. He made his way down the corridor. His footsteps echoed faintly, like they were being swallowed by the air. Every so often, he passed a loose panel or a floating object drifting in patches of unstable gravity. A wrench floated past him, rotating slowly. He grabbed it and clipped it to his belt. Tools would matter. Tools always mattered. Mark reached the central junction, a wide-open area meant for gathering during emergencies. He expected to find people there, scared passengers, maybe injured crew. Instead, he found only a single flickering hologram showing a spinning red warning symbol. He wasn't alone, though. A faint sound broke the silence. A quiet voice. Help. Mark spun around. A young officer sat slumped against the wall, clutching his leg. The metal beam beside him had snapped in half, pinning his lower body. Mark rushed over. Hold still, Mark said. I've got you. He used the wrench and his own strength to pry the broken beam upward just enough for the officer to pull his leg free. When the metal dropped again, it shook the floor with a loud clang. Thank you. The officer whispered, breathing fast. I thought I was done. Mark looked at the injured leg. Not broken, but badly bruised. The officer could stand, but barely. What happened after the wormhole? Mark asked. The officer shook his head. Everything went crazy, systems overloaded. Alarms everywhere. Then there was this light. And I woke up here. He looked around shakily. Where is everyone? Mark didn't know. But he had a guess, either scattered across the ship or trapped somewhere worse. Together they limped toward the command lift. The doors were jammed open at an angle, sparks dancing at the edges. The officer tapped the controls, but they didn't respond. The whole system was offline. We'll need to climb, Mark said. Climb? The officer stared at the dark shaft behind the broken doors. It's either that or stay here, Mark replied softly. The officer nodded after a long, fearful moment. Mark climbed first, using the emergency ladder built into the wall. The officer followed slowly, gritting his teeth with each movement. The shaft stretched upward into darkness, but halfway through, Mark noticed something strange. Gravity shifted again. For a moment, his body felt weightless, and his hand almost slipped from the rung. He held tight, breathing fast. Careful. He warned. I noticed. The officer called back. They reached the next deck and pulled themselves out. The hallway here was worse, walls dented, ceiling cracked, lights completely dead. The only illumination came from the dim emergency strips glowing along the floor. The silence felt heavier than before, like the ship itself was holding its breath. Mark tried another comm panel. This one flickered, then displayed part of a map. Many sections of the ship were marked red. A few were marked yellow. Only one section, the bridge, flashed green. Someone is alive up there, Mark said. The officer let out a shaky laugh of relief. Thank God. Let's go. They moved toward the bridge, stepping over scattered debris and drifting objects. The deeper they went, the stranger things became. Doors were twisted like clay, windows showed strange streaks of dark blue light outside, as if space itself hadn't fully settled. The ship wasn't just damaged, it felt wrong, like it didn't belong where it was. Mark felt it too, a low vibration through the metal floors, almost like breathing. He didn't say anything, but he walked faster. They turned a corner and found a group of crew members gathered in the dim hall. Some were injured, some shaking with fear, but they were alive. A senior officer stepped forward immediately. Engineer Hale. We thought you were dead. Not yet, Mark said, forcing a small smile. What's the situation? The officer's expression hardened. We're in uncharted space. No star maps match what we see outside. Long-range comms are down. Something is blocking all signals. Mark felt a chill crawl down his spine. The wormhole? Maybe. Or something else. The officer hesitated. There's a signal. Very faint. Repeating. We picked it up a few minutes ago. A distress call? Mark asked. That's what we hoped, the officer said quietly. But it's strange. The code doesn't match human patterns. Mark frowned. Then whose is it? The officer swallowed. We don't know. But it sounds like something calling for us. Mark didn't like the way he said that. And outside the nearest window, something huge moved through the dark. The faint signal kept repeating in the background, soft, rhythmic, and almost musical. It pulsed through the ship's thin walls like a heartbeat, steady and strange. Mark stared at the window where he'd seen movement outside, but the glass now reflected only the dim corridor and the worried faces behind him. Whatever passed through the darkness was gone, for now. The senior officer tapped a console, trying to strengthen the signal. The screen flickered with jagged lines of code, looping patterns, and bursts of distorted tones. Every crew member nearby stood tense, listening even though they didn't understand a single bit of it. It's almost familiar, Mark said quietly. The officer turned to him. Familiar how? Mark hesitated. He wasn't a linguist or a signals expert. He was an engineer. But something about the rhythm made his skin crawl. It was the kind of pattern he had heard long ago, back when he helped repair a Dragon comm relay during a joint training mission. Dragon battlefield codes weren't exactly public knowledge, but engineers fixing broken equipment often overheard things. It sounds like a warning code, Mark finally said. Old Dragon military style. But broken. Murmurs spread through the crew. The injured officer Mark rescued tightened his grip on the wall rail. But dragons didn't come through the wormhole with us, someone whispered. No, Mark said. They didn't. The signal pulsed again, slower now, almost tired. As if whatever sent it was struggling. The crew looked uneasy. Some stepped back. Some stared at the floor. Even without knowing the code, they could feel the weight behind it, the exhaustion, the fear, the sense of something stalking nearby. The senior officer crossed his arms. Whatever is out there might be dangerous. Or it might be someone in need of help. Either way, we need to understand what we're dealing with. Mark nodded. We should get the engine room stable first. If the reactor is failing, we won't survive long enough to decode anything. That suggestion brought a few pale nods. The ship felt fragile, like it could fall apart with one wrong move. The senior officer gestured toward the damaged hallway. Take who you need and go, Hale. The reactor readings are unstable. If you can't fix it, this starliner becomes a drifting coffin. Mark drew a slow breath. All right, let's move. He gathered a small team of 3 crew members, 2 technicians and the injured officer who insisted on going despite the limp. They headed toward the lower decks, walking through broken hallways and emergency lights that flickered like dying candles. The further they went, the more uneasy everyone felt. Gravity shifted several times, pulling them sideways or lifting them off the floor before dropping them again. It made their stomachs twist and their knees shake. The strange blue glow outside the windows pulsed like lightning trapped in slow motion. Do you feel that? One technician asked softly. Mark did. A faint vibration, steady and slow. Like something pressing against the ship's hull from the outside. They didn't speak again after that. The elevator systems were dead, forcing them to climb down stairwells warped from gravitational stress. Some steps bent under their weight. Other steps were missing entirely. Mark used the handrails to help the injured officer across gaps. When they reached the engineering deck, the door was half crushed and jammed shut. Mark and the others had to force it open with metal bars and the strength of their shoulders. When it finally slid aside with a grinding shriek, a wave of hot air rushed out. The engine room looked like it had survived a battle. Sparks jumped from exposed cables. Pipes hissed steam. A thick smell of burnt plasma filled the air. The coolant systems flashed red across every console. Mark's heart sank. We're close to overload, he said. He moved fast, dropping to one knee beside a blown-out junction box. His hands worked automatically, removing damaged components, rewiring circuits, bypassing fried modules. Sweat rolled down his face. His fingers shook, not from fear but from exhaustion. He could feel the ship trembling, as though the hull strained against something massive outside. One technician climbed the upper scaffolding to check the plasma stabilizers. Another worked to restart the cooling tower. The injured officer monitored the reactor readings on a half-functioning screen. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the coolant pumps roared to life, spraying cold mist over the overheated reactor shell. The red warnings faded to yellow. Then, after several tense seconds, dropped to green. Mark let out a shaky breath. "Reactor stable," the injured officer said softly. "For now." Before Mark could reply, the strange signal pulsed again, louder this time. The walls vibrated with its rhythm. The lights dimmed almost in fear. Then a pair of sharp beeps echoed from the technician on the scaffolding. "Engineer Hale. You need to see this." Mark climbed up quickly. The technician pointed to a small external sensor feed. The image was grainy and distorted by static, but clear enough. Something huge drifted past the ship, a shape made of twisted darkness and faint glowing lines, like bones made of starlight. It moved with slow, eerie grace, circling them the way a predator circles wounded prey. Mark's breath caught in his throat. "What is that?" the injured officer whispered from below. No one answered. The creature, or whatever it was, stopped moving. Its glowing lines pulsed once. The signal inside the ship pulsed in answer. A perfect match. Mark felt a cold realization settle inside him. "The signal isn't a call for help," he said quietly. "It's a tracking pattern. It's marking us." The technicians froze. "So it's calling that thing to us?" "No," Mark said, voice low. "It already found us. The signal is telling it we can't run." The lights flickered again. The engine room shook. And outside, the giant shadow turned toward them. A deep, hollow sound, like a distant roar, echoed across the hull. Mark didn't know what it was, but one thing was clear. It wasn't here by accident. It wasn't curious, it was hunting. The creature outside the ship drifted closer, slow but deliberate, as if savoring the moment before striking. Even through the static-filled feed, its outline looked impossible, like a skeletal frame made of dark matter, wrapped in thin strands of glowing energy that pulsed like veins. It had no eyes that Mark could see, yet he felt its attention focused directly on them. Every instinct in his body screamed danger. The engine room vibrated again, not from the ship's machinery but from something pressing against the hull. It wasn't a direct hit, more like a test, a gentle push to see how strong the metal was. The technicians backed away from the monitor. Even the injured officer's breathing grew shallow. "Is it trying to get in?" he whispered. Mark ran a hand across his forehead, smearing dirt and sweat. "If it wanted to get in, it already would've. That thing. It's studying us." The signal pulsed again, echoing through the air like a whispered chant. The creature's glowing lines responded with a soft shimmer. "It's communicating," Mark muttered. "Communicating with who?" a technician asked. Mark didn't answer because he didn't know. But his gut told him something terrifying: it wasn't communicating with them. The signal wasn't meant for the crew. It was being sent by something else near the ship. Something hidden. A soft rumble passed through the hull, like a giant exhaling. The lights flickered once, then steadied. "We need to leave this deck," Mark said, grabbing a toolkit. "If that thing hits us hard, this room will be the first to go. The reactor might hold, but the walls won't." They moved fast, climbing the stairs and pushing past mangled doors. Behind them, the engine room groaned under the pressure of the creature's presence. When the team reached the safer corridor above, another vibration shook the ship, this one sharper, like claws dragging across steel. Mark spun back toward the engine room entrance. For a second, he thought he saw the metal bulge inward, as if something pressed a giant thumb against it. But then it stopped. "It's toying with us," Mark said. They hurried toward the command deck. The path was filled with debris, broken light panels, twisted frames, drifting tool crates caught in strange pockets of weak gravity. They had to climb around collapsed support beams and walls bent by impossible forces. But the deeper they went, the more Mark noticed something unsettling. The shadows looked wrong. They didn't match the shapes around them. Sometimes they stretched too long. Sometimes they curled upward like smoke. Sometimes they moved even when nothing else did. At one point, a technician froze in his tracks. "Did you see that?" Mark did. A shadow slid across the ceiling, not fast but slow, like a giant careful not to be noticed. When they reached the central junction, they found another group of crew members, maybe 20 people. Some were armed with emergency weapons. Others held medical kits. Everyone looked tired, frightened, and confused. The senior officer hurried over. "We saw the sensor feed. What in heaven's name is that thing?" "A void harrower," someone whispered. Mark turned toward the speaker. It was a science officer who looked pale as paper. "You know what that is?" Mark asked. The officer shook her head, trembling. "Not exactly. Only rumors. Stories told in ancient alien records. Something dragons fought in their oldest wars." The kind of enemy they never wanted to speak about. Mark felt a chill in his bones. Dragon code. The signal. Yes, she said. It matches old data fragments. It's not calling us. It's calling others of its kind. Before anyone could respond, a loud metallic groan echoed through the corridor. The ship shook hard enough to knock several people off balance. Mark grabbed the nearest rail. A flashing warning lit up across every wall panel. Hull breach detected, Sector 12. Then another, Sector 13. And another, Sector 14. They're cracking the ship open like a fruit, the senior officer barked. We need a defense plan. Mark shook his head. We can't fight something like that. We don't even have real weapons. He looked around, heart pounding. The creature outside wasn't just big, it was patient. Intelligent. Watching them struggle, studying their reactions. Like a hunter learning how its prey moved. Then something happened that made everyone freeze. The signal that had been faint and steady suddenly stuttered, warped, and roared through the ship with crushing force. A deep, humming pressure pushed into everyone's skull like a claw made of sound. Some crew fell to their knees. Others grabbed their heads and screamed. Mark felt like someone pressed his brain between two stones. Then everything went silent again. The humming faded. The lights dimmed. Outside, the creature froze mid-motion. And then, it backed away. Not far. Not out of sight. But just enough to form space beneath it, space that began to twist. Space that folded. A tear slowly opened, similar to the wormhole that pulled them here but smaller and more controlled. Everyone stared. Something was coming through. A bright flash erupted inside the tear, lighting the ship like a star igniting. Mark shielded his eyes as a massive shape emerged, wings folded, scales shining like molten gold, eyes burning with furious light. A dragon. Not just any dragon. General Cinder. The very same veteran Mark gave his seat to. Behind him, 3 dragon strike flyers soared through the tier with weapons glowing. Mark whispered, he came back. For a moment, hope flickered in the darkness. But the moment the tier closed behind the dragons, the Void Harrower turned toward them, and the real battle began. General Cinder hovered outside the Starliner like a burning comet, his wings spread wide, his scales glowing with heavy battle energy. The 3 dragon strike flyers behind him formed a tight formation, their armor shining in sharp lines. Even through the shattered windows and damaged sensors, everyone inside the Aurora path felt the weight of their arrival. Dragons were powerful on any battlefield, but seeing them in this impossible place, surrounded by distorted space, felt almost unreal. Mark pressed closer to the window, breath caught in his throat. He had seen dragons in action before, in controlled training displays or old war footage. But this was different. Cinder's presence alone seemed to push the darkness back, like a torch held against a storm. One of the crew whispered, he came for us. Another whispered, he came for him, nodding toward Mark. But the fleeting moment of awe shattered when the Void Harrower twisted its enormous frame toward the dragons. That slow, drifting motion it used before was gone. Its glowing lines pulsed faster now, brighter, like a predator spotting a true threat. The darkness around it folded inward, almost as if the creature was drawing itself up to full height. The Harrower let out a deep, vibrating sound. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't even physical. It was like a pressure wave that made the ship creak and the air itself shudder. The scientists in the room covered their ears instinctively, even though the sound wasn't really heard, it was felt. Cinder responded with a low growl that vibrated the hull, though his voice came through the emergency speakers, magnified by a translation system. Human vessel Aurora Path, he rumbled. Stand your ground. We protect you. His wings folded once, then he launched forward. The strike flyers followed, spiraling around him like molten arrows. Their weapons glowed with strange energy, dragon tech, ancient, beyond human understanding. Cinder himself moved with a speed no one expected from a veteran with cracked scales and old wounds. The Void Harrower reacted instantly. Its skeletal limbs unfolded, spreading into long, blade-like shapes. The glowing veins across its body pulsed in a terrible rhythm. It lunged. Cinder slammed into it head-on. There was no explosion, no bright flash. Instead, space around them bent like soft metal. The impact rippled through the void, sending waves of distortion that flickered across the windows of the Starliner. The Harrower reeled back, its glowing veins flickering as though stunned. Dragons were powerful, yes. But the Harrower was ancient. Older than human science. Older than dragon kingdoms. A leftover from wars spoken only in whispers. Cinder roared a battle command, and the strike flyers scattered wide. They fired beams of condensed energy, slicing through the darkness like white-hot threads. The harrower dodged 2 beams but took a direct hit from the third. The impact left a glowing scar across its body, but the creature didn't bleed. Instead, the wound pulsed like a burning star before sealing partially. "It heals," Mark whispered. "It can heal." The crew behind him stepped back from the window. Outside, the harrower slashed at the dragons, its limbs moving with unnatural grace. Space warped around each strike. One of the dragons spun away just in time, but another took a glancing hit, spiraling as their armor flared under the pressure. Cinder moved to shield them, placing himself between the wounded flyer and the harrower. The starliner shook violently again. The harrower wasn't just attacking the dragons, it was pushing against the ship too, trying to break inside, to reach whatever energy it sensed within. The senior officer grabbed Mark's shoulder. "Hail! The reactor is drawing its attention. Whatever that thing wants, it's in our engines." Mark looked at the shaking walls and felt a deep cold in his chest. "Then we need to shut down everything except life support. If we don't, it'll tear the ship apart trying to get in." "But if we go dark, the dragons can't lock onto us," someone said. "If we stay bright," Mark countered, "we won't survive long enough for anyone to lock onto anything." The crew stared at him, torn. Finally, the senior officer nodded sharply. "Do it." Mark dashed toward the nearest control panel while another technician followed to help. Together they began shutting down every non-essential system. Lights flickered. Machinery powered down. The hum of the ship faded until only the faint life support systems remained. Outside, Cinder noticed immediately. "Human vessel, your light dims," he growled through the comms. "Do not surrender yourselves." "We're not surrendering," Mark responded breathlessly. "We're hiding." The harrower froze mid-motion as the ship's energy signature dropped. It drifted sideways, confused, its glowing lines dimming as it scanned the quiet starliner like a predator losing the scent. Cinder seized the moment and tore into the creature's flank, landing a blow so powerful that even the crew inside felt the shockwave. The harrower screeched, a terrible sound that twisted the space around it. Its limbs lashed out, striking one of the smaller dragons with crushing force. The strike flyer's armor shattered. Mark pressed a hand against the glass. "No." But the dragon wasn't dead. They drifted helplessly, wings limp, as Cinder called for formation change. Then something unexpected happened. The monitoring screen inside the starliner flickered with data. A second signal appeared, fainter than the first, but clearly different. A new pattern. A new rhythm. Mark stared at it. "That's not the harrower," he whispered. The science officer who earlier mentioned dragon myths leaned forward, pale. "It's coming from the other side of the wormhole tier. Something else is trying to break through." The senior officer felt the dread in the air. Another harrower? Mark looked at the strange new pattern, his heart sinking. "Worse," he said. "Something stronger. Something calling the harrower back." Cinder roared in fury as the void beast began retreating toward a forming tier, a recall signal. Mark's voice cracked. "General. Something else is coming." But Cinder already knew. And he wasn't going to let it through. Cinder didn't waste a breath. The new tier forming behind the void harrower was not like the violent rift that had swallowed the Aurora path. This one opened slowly, deliberately, like a door sliding open for an invited guest. Its edges glowed red instead of blue. The space around it twisted in harsh angles. The harrower's glowing veins brightened as it drifted toward the tier, answering the call like a hound hearing its master. Inside the starliner, the lights dimmed even further as the crew watched from the cracked observation windows. Fear tightened in every chest. The ship was quiet, powered down, trying to stay hidden, but it didn't matter. The monsters outside were not searching anymore. They were gathering. Mark's palms were sweating as he worked to keep the ship in low power mode. "If another one of those is coming, we can't stay here," he said, voice shaking. "We need that rift closed or we're done." The science officer shook her head. "Humans can't close a wormhole. You'd need a stabilized jump engine, ancient tech." "Dragon tech," Mark finished. Everyone turned toward the window again. Cinder had positioned himself between the harrower and the forming tier, wings flared wide, body glowing brighter than before. His deep, thunder-filled voice rattled through the comm systems. "I will not allow them passage." One of the smaller dragons shouted through the link, "General, fall back. This is not a battle we can win." Cinder didn't move. His tail whipped once, carving a bright arc in the void. "If we retreat, the humans die. If the humans die, the void spreads. We stand." Mark felt his throat tighten. The general had no reason to risk his life for humans, except one small act of kindness in the shuttle bay. But dragons never forgot debts. And they never let weakness guide their decisions. Mark forced himself back into action. We need to support him. If that tier opens, even the dragons can't stop what comes through. How? A crewman asked. We don't have weapons. Mark stared at the dim lights flickering overhead. We have the reactor. Everyone froze. The senior officer stepped forward. Explain. Mark swallowed hard. Dragons use concentrated plasma arcs for high-energy combat. Our reactor is weak right now, but if I can route it through the stabilizer coils, I might be able to blast the tier with a focused energy spike. It won't destroy it, but it could disrupt the opening long enough for the dragons to push the harrower back. The science officer stared in alarm. You're talking about overloading the coils. If you do that, someone will have to stabilize the surge manually. That's suicide. Mark took a slow breath. I know. The room fell silent. Then the injured officer, limping, sweating, still determined, stepped forward. I'll do it. Mark shook his head immediately. You can barely walk. You'd die before reaching the controls. The senior officer clenched his jaw. We draw lots. No, Mark said firmly. This was my plan. My responsibility. I go. Before anyone could argue, the ship shook again, harder. A thundering impact hit the hull. The harrower had turned back toward the starliner, its glowing veins pulsing in vicious rhythm. It wasn't waiting for the reinforcements anymore. It wanted to kill something now. Cinder intercepted it again with a furious roar. Their clash bent the space between them, sending ripples across the starliner. But the harrower had grown more aggressive, striking faster and harder. Its limbs blurred as they sliced through the void, leaving trails of blackfire behind. The strike flyers dove in, firing again and again, but the harrower's healing had accelerated. Wounds sealed almost instantly. One dragon tried to get too close and was struck by a tail-like limb made of pure darkness. The impact sent the dragon spiraling into the distance. Cinder can't keep this up, Mark said. His decision hardened inside him like cooling steel. I'm going. He grabbed his toolkit and sprinted toward the engineering shaft before anyone could stop him. The injured officer hobbled after him, shouting, but Mark didn't slow down. This wasn't bravery. It was necessity. If he didn't act, everyone, dragon and human, would die. The climb to the reactor felt longer this time. The ship's gravity kept warping, pushing him sideways or lifting him off his feet entirely. He caught rungs by luck more than skill. The entire structure creaked as if begging to collapse. Sparks rained from overhead as he passed broken conduits. When he reached the engineering deck, the walls throbbed with the harrower's attacks echoing through the hull. The reactor chamber glowed dangerously bright, already unstable from the earlier damage. Mark forced open the manual control panel. The system readouts were chaotic, energy flows twisting in unpredictable loops. He had only one chance to route the power through the stabilizer coils without blowing the reactor. He whispered to himself, come on. Just hold together for a few minutes. Outside, Cinder's roar echoed through the comms. Human Mark hail. Mark's breath caught. He tapped the comm panel. I'm here. Your ship dimmed its light. But I feel its heart beating again. What are you doing? Mark stared at the reactor, heart pounding. Trying to help you close that tier. A moment of silence. Then, something he never expected. You act with the courage of a dragon. The words hit harder than any blow. Mark's hands trembled for a second. Then he pushed forward, rerouting the energy lines. The reactor hummed louder. Heat washed over him. Alarms chimed in warning. One last switch. One last surge. Now, Mark shouted. Outside, the Starliner's stabilizer coils exploded with brilliant white light. The energy beam shot out like a spear, slicing the space around the forming tier. The tier crackled violently, twisting in on itself. The harrower recoiled, shrieking in a soundless rage. Cinder didn't waste the opening. He slammed into the harrower with every last ounce of strength his battered wings could give. The void beast staggered. The tier spasmed. And for the first time since being pulled into this nightmare, victory seemed possible. But then the reactor chamber behind Mark screamed with a high-pitched whine. The system was overloading. Mark's breath froze. He didn't know if the ship, or he, could survive the next minute. Mark didn't need the alarms to understand what was happening. The pitch of the reactor told him everything. It had gone from a stressed whine to a piercing scream, the kind that meant the internal coils were stretching beyond safe limits. The panel in front of him flickered with bursts of red warning symbols. Power surged through the conduits like a living thing. If he didn't stabilize the overload, the reactor would rupture and tear the ship apart. He swallowed hard. There was no time to run. No time to think. Only time to act. He yanked open the emergency access panel and reached into the nest of glowing wires and coolant pipes. The heat bit into his skin almost instantly. His eyes watered, the taste of metal filled his mouth. He couldn't see straight, but he could still feel the pathways, the lines of power, the flow of charge. He knew this reactor like a heartbeat. He just needed to slow it down, bleed a little of the energy away, keep the coil from ripping itself apart. But doing that required staying inside the chamber. The ship shuddered violently, so hard that Mark stumbled forward and cracked his shoulder against the console. A deafening roar vibrated through the hull. Dust and sparks rained from the ceiling. "Cinder?" Mark whispered. He activated the external camera feed with trembling fingers. Outside, Cinder was locked in direct combat with the Harrower, both of them tangled in a storm of distorted space. Cinder's wings burned bright with energy. His claws were sunk deep into the Harrower's glowing lines, tearing at them with primal fury. The Harrower fought back with equal force, its limbs slashing through void currents, its body flickering between solid and shadow. The other dragons circled, firing bursts of plasma, trying to keep the Harrower off balance. But they were exhausted. Their movements were slower, their armor cracked, their weapons flickering. They couldn't hold out much longer. The tier behind the Harrower flickered like a dying flame, stabilized by the reactor surge, but only temporarily. If Mark couldn't keep that energy flowing at the right frequency, the tier would reopen, stronger than before. Another void creature would emerge. Something far worse than the Harrower. He jammed his hands deeper into the open panel, twisting one connector and rerouting a second. A blast of heat surged up his arms. He hissed in pain but didn't let go. The reactor's scream softened, just a little, but not enough. Not safe. Not stable. He needed more time. A voice rumbled through the comm system, deep and strained. "Human Mark Hale. Retreat." It was Cinder. He sounded as if he was speaking through clenched teeth. Mark shook his head even though the general couldn't see him. "I can't. If I leave now, the coil collapses and the tier opens. You'll be overwhelmed." Cinder roared, not in anger but desperation. "Your body is weak. You will break." Mark set his jaw. "Better me than all of us." A long silence followed. Even through the chaos, Mark felt the general weighing this, measuring the worth of one man against the galaxy-sized threat before them. Dragons calculated life and death differently. Honor meant something hard, something sharp. At last, Cinder spoke again, voice rough. "I come." "No," Mark shouted. "Stay out there. You're holding it back." But Cinder had already made up his mind. Mark saw it on the external feed, the general breaking away from the Harrower, wings flaring in a burst of blinding golden fire. The creature lunged after him, furious, but the remaining dragons blasted it with coordinated strikes, buying their commander precious seconds. Cinder shot toward the ship like a meteor. "No, no, no, what is he doing?" Mark whispered. He stumbled back from the panel as the ship's outer hatch slammed open. A massive, blazing figure forced his way inside, filling the corridor with scorching heat and cracking light. The ship groaned under the weight of the dragon's arrival. Metal bent. Lights shattered. Then Cinder stood in the reactor chamber doorway, wings scorched, scales cracked and glowing, eyes burning with determination. "Move aside, human." Mark stared in shock. No. If you come in here, you'll make the overload worse." "No," Cinder growled. "I will contain it." Before Mark could stop him, the dragon stepped into the chamber. The heat inside intensified instantly, drawn towards Cinder's form like metal filings pulled to a magnet. The energy lines in the reactor reacted as though alive, wrapping, bending, coiling toward the dragon. He could absorb it. Dragons of old had done this, absorbed raw beam energy on battlefields to prevent catastrophic blast waves. But those were young dragons. Healthy dragons. Not wounded veterans already bleeding light. Cinder reached the core, braced both claws against the containment ring, and roared, a sound that shook the world. The energy pouring through the coil surged into him, lighting his entire body like a burning star. His voice thundered through the chamber. "Continue your work. Now." Mark snapped out of his trance and dove for the control panel. With Cinder absorbing the worst of the overload, Mark could finally redirect the remaining power. He twisted the regulators and punched open a new coolant valve. The numbers on the display steadied. The reactor's scream softened into a strained hum. Outside, the Harrower shrieked as the tier behind it collapsed, folding in on itself like a crushed lung. Space smoothed. Light dimmed. The Harrower convulsed, its glowing veins flickering in agony. The dragons outside seized their chance, firing everything they had left. The harrower burst apart, dissolving into streaks of dark mist. Mark slumped against the console, shaking. He had no strength left. His vision blurred. The reactor stabilized. The tier sealed. But Cinder. Mark looked toward the dragon. The general was still standing, but barely. His wings hung limp. His scales dimmed. Smoke curled from his chest where the energy had burned through armor and skin. His massive body swayed. Mark stumbled toward him. Cinder? The dragon lowered his head. You gave me your seat. And so I give you my shield. Then the great warrior collapsed. The ship's alarms went silent. And for the first time since the nightmare began, nothing moved. Mark's ears rang with a deep, throbbing silence. Not the silence of peace, this one felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting to see if anything still lived inside the broken starliner. The reactor chamber was dim now, bathed only in faint red emergency lights and the soft glow of cooling pipes. Smoke drifted lazily in the air. The floor beneath Mark's hands trembled with leftover energy, like the metal itself was exhausted. Cinder's massive body lay motionless in the center of the room, slumped forward where he had fallen. His claws were still partly wrapped around the reactor housing, scorch marks etched into the floor beneath him. His scales, once bright and fearsome, had turned dull, almost gray around the edges. Only faint lines of dim gold pulsed weakly along his sides, flickering like dying embers. Mark forced himself forward, dragging his aching legs. Each step felt like walking through thick sand. Cinder? He whispered, voice hoarse. No answer came. He reached out and touched the dragon's forearm. The heat had faded. The scales felt rough and fragile under his trembling fingers. A wave of dread washed over Mark. No. No, don't do this, he whispered. You can't. He didn't know if the dragon could hear him. He didn't know if dragons heard sound the same way humans did in this state. But he knew one thing, Cinder had stayed alive through battles that should have killed him 100 times. He didn't deserve to die here, alone in a dark chamber. Mark pressed his forehead lightly against the dragon's arm. You kept your promise. You protected us. So don't you dare give up now. A faint hum came from Cinder's chest, weak, barely there, but real. The dragon's breathing was shallow, but present. Mark let out a shaky breath of relief. The corridor outside the chamber echoed with running footsteps. Several crew members appeared in the doorway, led by the senior officer. Their eyes widened when they saw the sight. The dragon collapsed over the stabilized reactor, Mark kneeling beside him, the room filled with scorch marks and damaged metal. My God! One of them whispered. How are either of you alive? Mark didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was too tight. The senior officer knelt beside him. Help me check his vitals. Dragons are different. But maybe we can at least stabilize him. The science officer, pale and shaking, arrived carrying a portable scanner. She activated it with trembling hands. The device hovered over Cinder's chest, projecting ghostly holographic lines. She sucked in a sharp breath. He absorbed an impossible amount of energy. No biological system should survive this. Mark looked up at her, eyes burning. But he did. Yes, she whispered, he did. The senior officer turned to two nearby crewmen. Get medical stretchers, dragon-sized, reinforced. If we don't have those, grab cargo platforms. Move. The crew scattered. Mark stayed kneeling beside Cinder, not willing to move until the dragon was safe. The science officer gently touched Mark's shoulder. You should sit down, she said softly. Your vitals are bad too. Mark shook his head. Later. You could pass out. Later, he repeated. She didn't argue again. Outside the starliner, the space where the harrower had died was still shimmering with faint trails of dark mist. The remaining dragons circled the ship slowly, wings beating sluggishly. They were injured, deep wounds along their sides, broken armor plating, torn wing membranes. But they stayed there, standing guard in the void, refusing to leave until they knew the humans were safe. When the cargo platform finally arrived, it took 6 people to maneuver it close enough. Cinder's body was too large, too heavy, even in zero-gravity pockets. They had to winch him carefully, step by step, while Mark stayed close, holding steady the dragon's head to keep it from hitting the metal floor. When they finally secured Cinder on the platform, Mark's arms shook from exhaustion. The senior officer placed a hand on his shoulder. We'll get him to medical. You did enough. Mark shook his head. No. I'm going with him. The officer opened his mouth to argue, but the look in Mark's eyes stopped him. Very well, he said softly. Stay with him. As they pushed the platform through the corridors, other crew members gathered around, silent. Many had never seen a dragon up close before. Some had never imagined they would owe their lives to one. More than a few stared at Mark with something like respect. Others with confusion. Some with awe. At the medical bay, they lifted Cinder onto a reinforced bed designed originally for heavy cargo analysis, not living creatures. But it held. The medics rushed around, scanning, injecting stabilizers, adjusting the ambient temperature to dragon-friendly levels. Mark sat on a stool beside him, staring at the unmoving form. "Is he going to make it?" he whispered. The chief medic hesitated. He should. Dragons are tougher than anything we know. But this is new territory even for them. Mark nodded slowly. The room fell quiet again. A few minutes later, the comm system crackled weakly. "This is flyer talk. General Cinder lives?" Mark quickly grabbed the radio. "Yes. Barely. But yes." A long exhale followed. "Then we hold position. The humans are under our wing." Mark looked at the dragon on the bed. His chest rose and fell in slow, steady breaths. Alive. Fading, but alive. Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You saved us," he whispered. "I won't forget." The room dimmed again as the ship's emergency power tried to recover. Mark's eyes drifted to the window. Beyond it, faint stars shimmered, strange ones, unfamiliar ones. The Aurora path was still lost in impossible space. They had survived, but they were far from safe. And somewhere out there, beyond the dark horizon, the echo of that second signal, the one stronger than the harrower, still lingering in the void. Waiting. Watching. Calling. Mark felt a shiver travel down his spine. The nightmare wasn't over. It was only changing shape.